The Jazz Age was a time where old ideas were thrown away and new ideas were developed. Jazz music was an accessory to the development of these new ideas. Culture changed, ethics changed, beliefs about genders changed, and so many other changes occurred during this time. It made life better and more fun. Jazz music was spread nationwide through the first large-scale radio broadcast. People expressed themselves more during this time, and it came to be known as the flamboyant, anything-goes era, coined by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald is the author of the book The Great Gatsby, and it was based on the Jazz Age. The book portrayed a very close proximity to the actual events that occurred during the Jazz Age. Women began smoking, drinking, and doing drugs, all things opposite of the previous social norms before this time. These women were known as flappers, and they are one of the highlights of the Jazz Age. People would party all the time and be fun, active with each other, which is why this time was called the Roaring Twenties. There isn't any other time in history that was as alive as the 1920s were. With all great music comes a new culture, and jazz built one of the best cultures of all time. Without jazz music, it would have taken much longer to develop the rights of women. Without jazz music, it would have taken longer for women to not just be typical household ladies that couldn't drink or smoke. Without jazz, they wouldn't have discovered the pleasures of the back seats in the Model T car, also known as the struggle buggy, known for the extracurricular activities that occurred between man and women in the back seat of the car. Without jazz, life wouldn't be what it is today, and the Jazz Age developed some of the greatest ideas and new developments of the 20th century.
During the 1920s, the term flapper was coined to describe young girls who were still partying in their 20s and hadn't entered womanhood yet. The 1920s accomplished independence for women being able to have their own jobs rather than being a housewife while the men were at war. As women began to earn their own rights, like the right to vote, they started to break away from their conservative values, like wearing skirts down to your ankles and hardly wearing any makeup. The 1920s was a liberal time for women to be carefree and express themselves by wearing dark makeup as well as revealing clothing to dance in order to make movement easier, like short skirts and brassieres. Flappers flaunted and promoted sexual freedom, and which was not proper for young women to express openly, previous to and during the 1920s. Young women were immorally smoking and drinking in public during the Prohibition, which was highly frowned upon by older women and considered unladylike. Prior to the 1920s, it was a taboo for women to party and partake in activities such as drinking alcohol and doing drugs. Women were supposed to get married at a young age and take care of the house and raise the children while the husband was at work making money to support the family. The 1920s was a time for experimentation for young women who were not ready to settle down, and this generation of women became known as the flappers.
Prohibition 1920s. In 1917, shortly after the United States entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson placed a temporary prohibition to save grain to help more money to produce food. That same year, Congress submitted a new amendment, a time frame in American history in the 1920s. The ratification of the 18th Amendment was placed in the United States Constitution, which banned the manufacture, the transporting, and the selling of alcohol and intoxicating liquors. By that action, that increased the production of the sales of illegal liquors known as bootlegging. This also led a huge rise in gang violence and a large amount of crimes. By the end of the 1920s, nobody wanted prohibition anymore. In early 1933, The 21st Amendment was proposed to repeal the 18th Amendment, and it was then ratified by the end of the year, then the end of the Prohibition era. Now I'm going to tell you guys a couple common questions on the Prohibition of 1920s. Why was Prohibition bad? Because it made people break the rules even more. Now, because it was a little harder to find, it was illegal, but they still found a way around it. What did it influence? It rose gang violence, and it also raised the rate of crimes related to alcohol. How did they enforce Prohibition? The enforcement of Prohibition was very unsuccessful. People learned how to create their own homemade alcohols. This is the birth of what we know now called moonshine. People were still able to get alcohol. Why was this the case? Because people went and bought cases and cases of alcohol when they heard about the Prohibition, and they stocked up ahead of time so that whenever it became illegal, they still had it stocked up in their houses. What was the temperance movement? This is the movement that led to Prohibition. The people that wanted to limit the alcohol consumption and the sales and the manufacturing. Did people party more because alcohol was illegal, or did they party more when it was legal? They partied about the same.
Due to increased financial prosperity in the 1920s, there was a rise in disposable income. This, paired with the advancements in technology, led to an increase in leisure and consumption in people's everyday lives. Mass media gave rise to the expansion of radios, sports, and movies. Radios were introduced during World War I, but did not become common in American homes until the 1920s. Radios created an accelerated process of creating a shared culture in the United States and was far more effective than print media due to westward expansion. Because radio was more accessible from coast to coast, advertising on the radio got the word out much faster than newspapers. People were able to sit and listen to music via the radio and then hear advertisements on commercial breaks, much like we do today. Had the radio not become widespread, sports would not have grown in popularity like they did. People were able to listen to sports from the comfort of their own homes. Families would sit at home and listen to the game, so if they were unable to attend the game, they would still know what was going on without having to wait for the score the next day in the paper. The rise of moving pictures, or movies as we call them today, in the early part of the decade led to tons of movie theaters springing up across the country. Americans would go to the movies to forget their problems and lose themselves in another world or era. People of all ages attended the movies far more often than today. Many families would go to the movies more than once per week. Due to the rise of silent films, there was the first generation of movie stars. The rise of movie stars led to the American film industry moving to Southern California, what we now know today as Hollywood, to escape the cost of Thomas Edison's patents on camera equipment and a favorable climate for producing movies. Without the expansion of mass media in the 1920s, the way we know radio, sports, and movies today would not be the same.